Still I steady hand. I don't beg, I don't plan. Every step is carved in dust. No one left, I need a truck. Fearless code, written in scars, guided by the smoke and stars. No talk, no show, no lie, real men move with silence, lies us, lies us. Night comes slow, the streets still on. Another game, another gun, but I don't flinch, I don't fade. I'm the calm, the storm is made. Fear's a weapon I don't need. Power grows from what I fearless code, carved in stone. Every loss made me my own. No king, no gold, just a fear. Go. I walk alone, not 'cause I'm lost, but 'cause I burn the bridge that crossed. I answer to no face, no voice. This life wasn't given, it was my choice. No one above me, no God, no name. I built my fire.
Imagine being somewhere so remote that there is no quick way out. No streetlights, no cell service, no nearby house, no passing cars, just trees, water, mountains, and miles of empty country in every direction. Now imagine that while you're out there, you hear something calling to you. At first it sounds normal. Maybe it sounds like a cow bawling somewhere beyond the fence line. Maybe it sounds like a friend whispering from the edge of the lake. Maybe it even sounds like someone you know, someone you trust, saying they need help. But then something about it is wrong. The voice is too close, or it moves too fast, or it calls from two places at once. And suddenly, you understand that whatever is out there is not lost, and it is not asking for help. It is trying to get you to answer. Tonight, we have two Skinwalker horror stories from two very different wildernesses. One takes place on a lonely cattle allotment near the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, where an experienced ranch hand finds out that some boundaries exist for a reason. The other takes place in the boundary waters of Minnesota, where four friends follow the wrong canoe into a nightmare that knows their voices better than they do. So turn off the lights, settle in, and whatever you hear outside while this video is playing, don't answer it. But before we get into those stories, if you enjoy scary stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We upload new episodes every week, and if you like listening on the go or for sleep, you can also find the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. Leaving a rating or review helps grow the show. Now, let's get into it. I've worked cattle most of my life, and I'm not going to pretend I understand everything I've seen out there. A man who spends 40 years on horseback learns the country talks to him in its own way, and most of what it says is plain enough. Weather coming, water gone bad, a lion working a draw. You learn to read it the same way you read a man's face across a table. And after a while, you trust that reading more than you trust your own two eyes. Because the eyes can be fooled and the patterns can't. That's what I want you to understand before I tell you the rest of it. I wasn't a green kid out there. I knew what I was looking at most days. The summer I'm gonna tell you about is the one where that stopped being true, and I've never been able to make it true again. The outfit I rode for ran cattle on a forest grazing allotment, up against the Gila Wilderness boundary in southwest New Mexico, north and west of a little-nothing town called TweNtyGAm3s. If you've never been out that way, I'll tell you it's some of the emptiest big country left in the lower part of the United States. The Gila's the first piece of ground anybody ever set aside as wilderness in this country, back in 1924, and they meant it. No roads to speak of past a certain point. No motors of any kind allowed across the line. Just mountains stacked on mountains, juniper and pinon down low, ponderosa up high, and canyons that'll swallow a day's ride before you found the bottom. The allotment I worked was a few thousand acres of permitted range that bumped right up against that boundary. And the fence between the two was an old 4-strand barbed wire affair that had been there longer than I had. That fence is going to matter, so hold on to it. I'd been on that outfit 11 years by the summer this happened. I was past 60 by then, riding for a man named Harlan, who'd inherited the permit and the cattle from his father and didn't much care for either, which suited me fine because it meant he left me alone to run things the way I knew how. I lived most of the grazing season in a line camp up near the high pasture, an old log cabin with a wood stove and a spring box and not much else. There was no electricity up there and no telephone, but I kept a battery 2-way radio in the cabin, the kind that runs off a dry cell pack, and I'd check in with Harlan on it every so often, and could raise a couple of the neighbors on it if I had to. And that was the one thread of talk I had to the outside world from that camp. I'd ride down to the headquarters in person, maybe once every couple weeks for supplies, and to tell Harlan everything was fine. That summer it wasn't fine, but it took me a long while to say so, because the things that were wrong didn't add up to anything a sane man could put in words. I want to give you a sense of how a day went up there before any of it started, because you can't understand how wrong it got unless you understand how ordinary it was supposed to be. I'd be up before the sun most mornings, because that's the habit of a lifetime, and there's no breaking it past a certain age. I'd build up the stove and put coffee on and stand in the door of that cabin with a cup of it and watch the light come into the meadow, and you could see the cattle from there, the near bunch of them down in the low end of the park where the grass was good and the spring ran. I'd watch them a while to see how they were laying and how they were grazing, because cattle tell you things in the morning if you watch them, and then I'd go catch up whichever horse I meant to ride that day. I kept 4 head of horses up at that camp, in a little trap behind the cabin, and I'd rotate through them so none of them got worn too hard, because there isn't a vehicle made that does you any good in that country, and a man on that allotment is only as good as the horses under him. I'd grain whichever one I'd caught, and saddle, and by full light I'd be horseback, and headed out to whatever the day called for, and the days called for plenty. A grazing allotment that size isn't a thing you just turn cattle loose on and forget. There's fence, miles and miles of it. The wilderness boundary on the high end, and the drift fences down low, and the cross fences between pastures, and all of it wood and wire, and all of it always going down somewhere. A post rotted off, or a wire broke, or a tree come down across a stretch in a wind, and a good part of any week was riding fence with a pair of pliers and a sack of staples on the saddle, finding the breaks and fixing them before the cattle found them first. There's water to see to, the springs and the dirt tanks, making sure they're running and clean, and that a cow hasn't bogged herself in the mud at the edge of one, and died there. There's the cattle themselves to keep account of, riding through the bunches and counting and looking them over, watching for one that's gone lame, or one that's pink-eyed up, or a cow that slipped her calf, doctoring what needs doctoring out of the bag I carried behind the cantle. There's salt to pack out to the salt grounds. There's pasture to rotate them through so you don't graze any one piece down to dirt. It's a lot of work for one man, and I did it alone, and I liked it that way. The long, quiet days, horseback in big country, with nobody to answer to, and nothing to do but the work in front of me. I'd come in at dark, wore out in the good way a man gets wore out when he's done honest work, and I'd cook something on the stove and eat it and go to bed, and the next day I'd do it again. That was the life. I want you to have it clear in your head, the plainness of it, the ordinariness. Because the thing I'm going to tell you came into the middle of that ordinary life and unmade it a piece at a time. And the unmaking only means anything if you can first see how solid the thing was that got unmade. It started with a heifer in the middle of June. I found her on a Tuesday morning, I remember that much, because I'd been planning to ride the east fence that day, and I changed my plans when I came over a rise and saw the herd. They were bunched, now cattle bunch for reasons, and a man who knows them knows the reasons, and none of the good reasons were in play that morning. There was no storm. There wasn't a predator that I could see or smell. But there they were, 40-some head packed into a tight knot in the middle of an open park. Every one of them faced the same direction, looking off toward the timber on the wilderness side. Standing dead still, not grazing, not chewing, just looking. I sat my horse and looked with them for a while and saw nothing in that timber at all. And after a few minutes I rode down toward them and they didn't break, which was the first wrong thing, because they always break and drift when you come at them. They held, like something was holding them. The heifer was on the far side of the bunch, down on her side, and I knew she was dead before I got to her because of how she was lying. What I couldn't figure out was how. There wasn't a mark on her that I could find at first. No blood. No torn out throat the way a lion leaves them. No belly opened up by coyotes. None of the mess you expect. She was just dead, lying there with her eyes open and her legs straight out, and the grass around her wasn't disturbed. No drag marks, no sign of a struggle. A cow that's been killed by something fights, and the ground shows it, and there was nothing. It was like she'd lain down to die in a place she'd picked. I rolled her part way over to check the downside, and that's where I found it. On the underside of her neck, up high near the jaw, there was a single wound, small, maybe the size of the end of my thumb, punched clean through the hide and into her. No tearing around it. One hole, made by something that went in straight and came out straight. I'd never seen a thing like it on a cow in all my years, and I stood there a long time with my hand on her trying to make it be something I recognized. I couldn't. The herd never broke the whole time I worked over that carcass. When I finally got back on my horse and rode the bunch, hazing them out of the park and up toward better grass, they moved slow and reluctant and kept turning their heads back to that line of timber, and it took me the better part of an hour to get them moving like normal cattle again. I told myself it was a freak thing. A heifer can die of 100 causes, and the wound could have been a stub she fell on, a sharp branch, anything. That's what I told myself. I rode back 2 days later and dragged the carcass off with a rope and burned what the coyotes had left, and I put it out of my mind as best I could. It wasn't a freak thing. I know that now. It was the first one. It was the thing telling me it had arrived, and I just didn't have the language yet to hear what it was saying. The next 2 weeks were quiet enough that I'd almost talked myself all the way out of it. The cattle grazed and watered and acted right. I rode my fences and fixed what needed fixing. The spring was running good, and the grass was coming on heavy after a wet May, and a man can convince himself of a lot of normal when the country's giving him normal back. Then I lost a steer, and the second one took the last of my comfort with it. I found him the same way. The herd bunched and facing off toward the wilderness side, holding even when I came at them. He was down at the edge of a stand of timber this time, not out in the open. And when I got to him, the wound was the same. One hole, high on the throat, punched clean. But this time, there was something else, and it's the something else that I think about on the nights I can't sleep. There were tracks. The ground near him was soft from a seep that ran through there, just mud really, and pressed into that mud all around the carcass were prints I couldn't make sense of. Some of them were like a big cat, a lion, four-toed and round, except too big and the wrong shape. And some of them, right alongside, weren't animal at all. They were like a man's bare foot, a long, narrow human foot pressed deep into the mud, with toes, except the toes were too long, and there were marks at the end of them that a man's toes don't make. and the two kinds of track ran together, mixed up, like whatever made the cat tracks and whatever made the man tracks had been standing in the same place at the same time. Or, and this is the thought I couldn't shake even then, like it was the same thing, and it had changed from one to the other right there in the mud. I'm not a superstitious man. I want to keep saying that because I know how this sounds. I went to a one-room school and I read the Farmer's Almanac, and I believe in weather and grass and the price of beef, and not much past that. But I crouched there in that mud with my fingers on those tracks, and the hair came up on my arms, and the back of my neck the way it does when a lion's watching you, that you can't see. And I had the certain animal knowledge that I was being watched right then. I stood up slow, and I looked at that timber, and I didn't see anything. And I got on my horse, and I rode out of there, at a pace that wasn't dignified, and I'm not ashamed of it. I went back to those tracks the next day, in better light, with my head a little more level, because that's the kind of man I am. I don't like a thing I can't account for, and I'll worry at it. I spent the better part of a morning on that piece of mud. I followed the tracks both directions as far as I could carry them. Going one way, away from the carcass, they led up toward the wilderness fence, and they were the cat tracks doing it, the big round wrong ones, spaced out long the way a big animal moves when it's covering ground without hurry. Going the other way, toward the carcass and past it, they changed. I found the place where they changed. I want to tell you I found a clean spot where one kind of track stopped and the other started, where I could have said here's where the trick happened, but it wasn't clean like that. It was a churned up patch of ground, like something had stood there and turned and worked its feet. And on the near side of that patch it was cat coming in, and on the far side of it was the long man feet going out, and in the middle it was just torn mud with both kinds mixed through it, and there was no reading it. I knelt there a long while trying to make it be two animals, a lion and a man, that had happened to use the same ground, and I couldn't, because the timing was wrong. The man feet came down on top of the cat tracks in some places, and the cat tracks came down on top of the man feet in others, back and forth, like whatever it was had gone from the one to the other, and back more than once, right there, turning in place. I have tracked game and predators my whole life, and I know what the ground tells you, and the ground was telling me a thing I did not want to hear. I started keeping a closer count after that, and a written one, which I'd never bothered with before, because I'd always carried the herd in my head. I got a little notebook out of the supplies, the kind you'd keep a tally in, and I started writing down every animal I could put eyes on each day, and where, and what the herd was doing, and where I'd found them in the morning, versus where I'd left them at dark. I needed to see it written down to believe it, because the cattle were behaving in a way that a man can't quite credit while it's happening. And the notebook was the only thing that made it real, the same entry over and over in my own hand. Left them low park settled, found them strung on the wilderness fence at dawn, ground cut to pieces between. Night after night. I'd read back over a week of those entries by lamplight in the cabin, and the writing made it worse, not better, because you can argue yourself out of one strange morning, but you can't argue with a week of them in a row in your own handwriting. That night, back at the lime camp, I heard the first of what I'd come to hear a lot of that summer. I'd gone to bed early, worn down, and I came awake in the full dark with no idea what had woke me, the way you do. The cabin was dead quiet, and then out past the wall, out in the dark of the meadow, something made a sound. It was a cow. I'd swear to you on anything you put in front of me that it was one of my cows, a low bawling call, the sound a cow makes when she's lost her calf and is looking for it. Except I knew every animal on that allotment, and none of my cows had a calf at that time. And the sound was coming from up the slope, away from where I'd bedded the herd, up toward the wilderness fence. It would call and go quiet, and then call again from a slightly different spot, working back and forth along the slope. I lay there in the dark and listened to it, and my whole body knew that it wasn't a cow. A cow doesn't move that fast between calls. A cow doesn't go that quiet in between. It was something making the sound a cow makes, and doing it to see if I'd come out, and I did not come out. I lay there until it stopped, sometime in the small hours, and I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I rode down to headquarters. I told myself it was for salt and a few groceries, but it was really because I wanted to be around another human being for a few hours. Harlan was there, and his nearest neighbor on that side of the country had come by, an old fellow named Benny Sosi, who ran a few horses and some sheep on his own ground a ways down the valley. Benny was Navajo, Dime, and he'd lived in that country his whole life, longer even than me, and he and I had always got along fine over the years, the way two old men who both know cattle and horses get along. We'd shared coffee 100 times. That morning I was glad to see him, and I sat down with the two of them, and we talked weather and grass for a while. And then Harlan asked me how things were up at the allotment, just making conversation, and I made the mistake of telling the truth. I told him about the heifer and the steer, the wounds. I didn't say much about the tracks, just that I'd seen sign I couldn't read, and I didn't say anything at all about the thing in the night, because I wasn't ready to say that part out loud yet. Harlan made the noises a man makes, lion probably, or somebody's dog gone wild. And he wasn't real interested, because Harlan was never real interested in anything to do with those cattle. But I'd been watching Benny while I talked, and Benny had gone still. He'd set his coffee down, and when I mentioned about where it was happening, up against the wilderness fence on the high end of the allotment, and described the spot, Benny stood up. He didn't make a scene. He just said he had to get back to his place, that he'd been gone too long already, and he shook Harlan's hand, and he looked at me for a second. A long second, with something in his face I'd never seen there before. Then he left. I didn't think much of it right then, but I noticed that he didn't say the easy things a man says on his way out, the see you around and take care kind of things. He just looked at me and went. And here's the part I want you to hold on to. Benny Sosi had been stopping by Harlan's place, and stopping by my camp when he was up that way, for as long as I'd ridden for that outfit. After that morning, he stopped. He didn't come around once for the rest of that summer, not once. And it was a good while before I understood why. I rode back up to the allotment that afternoon with a bad feeling I couldn't put down. And the bad feeling was right, because that was the week it stopped killing cattle every so often and started working on me. The bawling came most nights now. Sometimes it was the cow sound, the lost calf bawl, working the slope above the camp. Sometimes it was other things. One night it was a calf, a young calf crying, which we didn't have, and it cried right up close to the cabin, just outside the window where the firewood was stacked, close enough that if it had been a real calf, I could have reached out and touched it. I lay in my bunk with my rifle across my chest, and I listened to that calf cry not 8 feet from my head, and I did not get up, and I did not open the door, because by then I had learned. Another night, it was coyotes, a whole pack of them yipping and singing the way they do, except it went on too long and too steady, and it never moved the way a real pack moves. And underneath the coyote sound, there was something else, a kind of low note that doesn't belong in a coyote, and I lay and listened to that too. The thing had 100 voices. That's the part that I think finally broke something loose in me. The understanding that it could be anything it wanted to be, that it had been listening to that country its whole long life, and it had every sound in it memorized, and it could put any one of them on like a man putting on a coat. I learned the rhythm of those nights whether I wanted to or not. It would start after full dark, never before, and never with the worst sound first. It would start far off, up the slope, with something ordinary, the cow ball usually, and it would work that one sound for a while, moving along the slope. And a man lying in the dark listening could almost talk himself into believing it really was a cow. That's how good it was, the first hour of it. And then it would come closer, and the sounds would start to change. And the closer it came, the less the sounds belonged. By the deep middle of the night, it would be near the cabin, and it would be running through things that had no business in that country at all. And the worst of it was never loud. The worst of it was always quiet, close, just past the wall. A small sound made right up against the logs where I was lying on the other side, like it knew exactly where my head was, and was putting the sound there on purpose. I started sleeping with the lamp lit. I started sleeping with the rifle in the bed. I started some nights not sleeping at all, just sitting up against the back wall with the lamp and the gun watching that door. And the thing seemed to know which nights those were, because the nights I sat up watching were the nights it worked the hardest, came the closest, ran through the most of its catalog, like it could feel me awake in there and was working on me. And the nights I finally gave out and slept were quieter, like it was content to let me sleep because a man who sleeps will sleep again, and deeper, and someday all the way through. And it could wait for that night the way it had waited for everything else. The cattle were coming apart. I'd ride out in the mornings and find the herd bunched and facing the timber more days than not now. And it was getting harder and harder to settle them and move them. They were going off their feed. A cow that won't graze loses condition fast. And my cattle were starting to show ribs in the middle of the best grass year we'd had in a decade, because they were spending their days standing in a knot staring at the wilderness side, and their nights doing God knows what. Because I'd find them in the mornings, in places I hadn't left them, packed up against fence corners, or jammed into the bottoms of draws, like they'd spent the dark hours running from one end of the allotment to the other. I lost a third animal in the second week of July, a good cow this time, and the wound was the same. The single clean hole high on the throat, and the tracks were the same, the big wrong cat prints, and the long human feet mixed together in the dirt by the carcass. And this time there was one more thing, the gate. There was a wire gate in the wilderness fence on the high end of the allotment, a gate I kept shut and tied, because there wasn't any reason to have it open, and every reason to keep my cattle on my side of the line. It was the kind of gate that's just a section of the fence you can take down, 4 wires stretched on a loose post that you lever into a wire loop top and bottom to hold it shut. I'd tied the top loop with a piece of baling wire on top of the loop because the wire had gone slack over the years, and I didn't trust the loop alone. That morning, when I came up on the dead cow, the gate was open. Standing wide open, the loose post laid back on the ground and the wires slack, and my baling wire wasn't broke. It was untwisted. Somebody, or something, had untwisted the baling wire I'd wrapped, the same way I'd have done it myself with 2 hands and time, and laid the gate open, and the cow had died 10 feet from that open gate on my side of it. I want to tell you what that did to me, standing there looking at that gate. A lion doesn't open a gate. A bear doesn't open a gate, not by untwisting wire. A man could open that gate, but no man had any reason to be up there, 10 miles from the nearest road, in country that takes a hard half-day's ride to reach, and no man kills a cow with 1 clean hole and leaves no other sign. I stood there and I made myself say it, finally, out loud, alone up there with the dead cow and the open gate. I said the word I'd been keeping away from for a month. I'd heard it over the years, the way anybody who works that country hears it, mostly from people half joking, and once or twice from people who weren't joking at all. Skinwalker. The dying have a name for it that they don't like to say, and a lot of them won't talk about it at all. And the white man word for it, the word that's gotten into all the stories, is skinwalker. A thing that was a person, or had been, that can wear the shape of an animal, that can throw its voice, that knows the country, and works it. I'd always thought of that as a story to scare children with. Standing at that gate, I didn't think it was a story anymore. I thought it was the only thing that fit, and I thought it had figured out the gate, and I thought it was working its way in toward me a little at a time, and I was right on all 3 counts. I closed the gate, I twisted the wire back, I rode the herd off that high pasture entirely, pushed them down to the lower country near my camp where the fence ran along a county road, and there was at least the idea of other people somewhere out past the trees. And for a few days I thought maybe I'd done something. Maybe putting distance between the herd and that boundary had bought me some peace. It hadn't. It had just told the thing that I'd learned the gate, and so it learned something new. It started coming into the camp meadow at night. The first night I knew it was close. I didn't hear a cow, or a calf, or a coyote. I heard my own name. I came awake in the dark, and there was a voice out past the cabin wall, low, calling my name the way Harlan calls it when he rides up, the way a man calls another man he knows. It said my name, And then it said something about the truck, that the truck was stuck, that I needed to come give him a hand. And the voice was Harlan's voice, near enough that if I'd been half asleep and not paying attention, I might have believed it. But Harlan was 40 miles away, and Harlan's truck couldn't get within 10 miles of my camp because there wasn't a road. And Harlan would no more ride up to my camp in the dead middle of the night than he'd fly. And I lay there in the black with that thing wearing my boss's voice calling me to come outside, and I understood exactly what it was doing. It wanted me out the door. Everything it had done for a month. The cattle, the wounds, the voices working closer and closer in the dark. All of it had been working toward getting me to open that door and walk out into the meadow in the dark. And it had run through the whole catalog of sounds the country had. And now it had landed on the one that might actually work. The voice of somebody I knew. Somebody I'd come out for. I didn't come out. I called back through the door, and I'm not proud of how my voice sounded, but I called back and I said I knew it wasn't Harlan, and it could go to hell. And the voice stopped. Just stopped. Mid-word almost. The way nothing real stops. And then there was a sound I'll hear until I die. A sound right up against the cabin wall. A low sound that wasn't any animal and wasn't any man. Somewhere down underneath both, and then nothing. Quiet the rest of the night. But I sat up against the wall with my rifle and a lamp burning, and I watched that door until the sky went gray, and I made up my mind sometime in those hours that I wasn't going to win this by hiding in a cabin. It already knew where the cabin was. It already knew I was in it. The cabin wasn't keeping it out. I was, by not opening the door, and a man's got to sleep. And the night I finally slept all the way through was the night it would get what it wanted. I rode down to headquarters the next day to think, and to be around Harlan, and because I'd half decided to quit. I'll be honest with you about that. I'd worked cattle through blizzards and droughts and a lightning strike that killed my horse out from under me. And I'd never once thought about walking off a job, and that morning I thought about it hard. But Benny Sosie's truck was at Harlan's place when I rode up, the first time I'd seen it since that morning a month before. And Benny was sitting on Harlan's porch, and when I came up he looked at me, and he stood up, and he came down off the porch to meet me, and I knew he'd come there to find me. He'd come to say something, and what he said, standing out by my horse where Harlan couldn't hear, was the thing that saved my life, though it didn't sound like much at the time. He didn't say a whole lot. He asked me, low, where it was killing the cattle, and I told him, up high, against the wilderness fence, and below the fence after I moved them down. And he nodded like that confirmed something he already feared, and he said a few things that I'm not going to repeat all of, because some of it was his and not mine to give away, and because some of it I promised him I'd keep. But the part that matters, the part he wanted me to have, was about the line. He told me that thing belonged to the country on the far side of that wilderness fence, that it was tied to that ground the way the water was tied to the springs, that it ranged, and it hunted, and it was clever past anything I'd dealt with, but that it was held somehow to its own country, and that the old boundary, the fence, the line my cattle's allotment butted up against, that line meant something to it that it didn't to me. He said the thing had been crossing because I'd left the way open. The gate, the slack wire. He said it would keep working its way across as long as there was a way across and a reason to come, but that it didn't want to be out of its own country any longer than it had to, that it was always pulling back toward the wilderness side, and that if I understood that, I had the only thing I needed to understand. I want to be careful how I tell the rest, because the rest is what I actually did, and I've turned it over in my mind 10,000 times since, and I still believe it was the only thing that could have worked. I rode back up to the allotment that evening with a different idea in my head than the one I'd come down with. I wasn't going to quit, and I wasn't going to sit in that cabin one more night, waiting for it to find the voice I'd opened the door for. I was going to give it what it wanted, which was for me to come out, and I was going to do it on my terms, and at the time of my choosing, and I was going to use the one thing Benny had told me, that the thing itself couldn't change. It was held to its own country. It wanted always to pull back across that line. So I was going to put the whole herd across the line for it, and let it have the wilderness side, and take the allotment back. I know that sounds backward, Let me lay it out the way I worked it out. The thing was killing my cattle and working on me, drawing closer every night. And the cattle were going to be dead by fall the way things were going. Every one of them either killed outright or run to bone. I couldn't fight it because I couldn't even see it. And what I could see, the cat tracks and the man tracks in the open gate, told me it was smarter and faster than anything I could lay a sight on. But it had a country, and the country had an edge, the wilderness fence, and on the far side of that edge was the thing's home ground, and the thing always wanted to go back to it. So if I drove my cattle off the allotment, off my permitted ground entirely, away from the boundary, down and out toward the county road and the lower country, where there were ranches and people and lights, and at the same time, I opened that high gate wide and left the thing's own country open to it, then there'd be nothing left on the allotment that it wanted. No cattle to kill. No man sleeping in a cabin to draw out into the dark. Just an open gate to its own ground and nothing on this side worth crossing for. Benny had told me it didn't want to be out of its country. I was going to make sure there was no reason left for it to be. It took me 3 days to gather the herd, working alone, and they were a wreck. Cattle that won't drive are about the most miserable thing a man can deal with, and these had spent a month being terrorized, and they were spooky and gaunt and prone to break in every direction. And I had 2 good horses, and I wore both of them down, and most of myself with them. The first day, I didn't gather much of anything. I just located them, because they'd scattered themselves all over that allotment in their nightly running, and they were holed up in 1s and 2s and little bunches in every draw and timber pocket on the place. A man gathers cattle by working them out of the rough and pushing them toward a holding ground, easy, slow, letting them string along, and that works when the cattle are settled. These weren't settled. I'd find a little bunch of them jammed up in the head of a canyon, and I'd start to ease them out and they'd break on me, scatter back past the horse in 3 directions, and I'd have to gather that same little bunch over again, and they'd break again. And a thing that should have taken an hour took half a day and left my horse lathered and my temper gone. They wouldn't lead and they wouldn't drive, and they'd lost the herd sense that makes cattle want to be together, because the thing had spent a month teaching them that together in a bunch facing the timber was where the dying happened. And now every animal wanted to be off by itself in the brush, which is the hardest way in the world to gather anything. I'd get 4 head moving toward the low park and lose 2 of them into a thicket, and have to leave the 2 I'd lost to keep the 4 I had, and then come back for the 2, and it went like that the whole first day, and at the end of it I had maybe a third of the herd loosely bunched in the low park, and the light was going, and I had to ride back to the camp for the night knowing the thing would scatter again in the dark whatever I'd gathered in the day, and it did. The second day was the first day over again, except worse, because now I was tired and the horses were tired, and the cattle had learned the day before that they could break past me and get away with it. I switched horses at noon, rode the second one into the same lather as the first by dark. I lost count of how many times I gathered the same animals, and lost them, and gathered them again. There's a particular kind of worn-out that comes from working stock that won't be worked, where it isn't the body so much as something behind the eyes that wears down. The steady grinding failure of it, push and break and push and break, and by the end of that second day, I had a little more than half the herd held in the low park, and I was about used up. And the thing in the dark that night seemed to know it, and worked me hard, and scattered what I'd gathered. And I started the third day with less than I'd ended the second. But the third day it turned, the way a gather sometimes does once enough of the cattle are together that the herd sense comes back into them. Once I had a big enough bunch held in the low park, the loose ones wanted to come to it, because a cow's nature is to be with other cattle, and that nature finally got the better of the fear, and the gathering got easier through that last day instead of harder. By the middle of the afternoon, I was bringing in the last stragglers to a herd that was holding itself together, and by evening I had them, all of them I could account for, bunched down in the lower park near the road, and I held them there overnight. And that last night was the worst of all of them, because the thing knew. I'd swear it knew. It came in close that night, closer than it ever had, working the dark all around the bedded herd, and it ran the whole catalog. It bawled like a lost cow. It cried like a calf. It called my name in Harlan's voice and then in Benny's voice, which it had never done before, which meant it had been close enough to us at Harlan's place to learn Benny's voice in one afternoon, and that turned my stomach worse than anything. It even, once, late, made a sound like a woman. And I'd lost my wife 8 years before that summer, and I won't tell you what that did to me to hear, out there in the dark, a sound like her. And I'll only tell you that I bit down, and I held the herd, and I did not answer, and I did not move toward it. The cattle were near to stampeding all night, and I rode that bunch in the dark till my horse was staggering, keeping them together, and the thing worked us the whole night long, and somewhere toward morning I understood that it had stopped trying to draw me out, and started just trying to scatter the herd, because it knew, it had figured out what I meant to do, and it was trying to bust the cattle loose and keep them on the allotment because the cattle were the only reason left for it to have a hold on me. I held them. I don't know how, but I held them, and the sky came gray, and then pink, and the thing went quiet the way it always did with the light, and I had a herd, ragged and terrified but whole, in the lower park by the road at dawn. I pushed them out that morning. The lower park where I'd gathered them was already a few miles down off the high country from the wilderness fence, and from there I drove the whole bunch off the allotment entirely, down the county road to a neighbor's holding pasture I'd raised him about on the radio, 10 miles of road with the cattle strung out and stumbling, and me and my last fresh horse working the drag, and it was the longest 10 miles of my life, and the easiest, because every step took them farther from that wilderness boundary, and I could feel the country letting go of them as we went, or maybe just feel myself letting go. By noon they were behind a good fence on the neighbor's place, with the neighbor's hand watching them, a good 15 miles of country between them and the wilderness line all told, and a world away. And then I did the second half, which I'd thought about the whole drive down, and which I did alone, and which I'll tell you took more nerve than anything else in my life. I rode back up, alone, all the way back up to the high end of the empty allotment, to the wilderness gate, in the afternoon while there was still good light, and I opened that gate wide. I untwisted my own wire and I laid the loose post back, and I stretched the 4 wires down, and I left the way to its own country standing open, the way it had wanted it open all along. I gave it back its boundary, open, and then, and this is the part I did that Benny hadn't told me to do, that was mine. I rode the whole length of that high fence, and I opened every other gate and gap I could reach, and where the fence was good and tight, I cut it. Now a man doesn't just walk up and snip a 4-strand fence that's stretched tight, not unless he wants a strand of barbed wire to come back across his face and take an eye out, or whip up under his horse and cut the animal to ribbons, because there's a lot of pull in a tight fence, and it comes loose all at once, and mean. So I killed the tension first the way you're supposed to, pulled the staples loose for a few posts on either side with the claw of the pliers, so the wire went slack along that stretch, and stood off to the side of it, and let what tension was left out of it easy before I ever made a cut. Then I cut my own employer's wilderness boundary fence in 3 places along that high stretch, careful and slack and from the side, so that the line wasn't a barrier at all anymore on the allotment side, so that the thing's own country wasn't fenced off from the empty ground, where there was nothing left to kill. I made the whole edge open. I gave it everything on its side, and I took everything off of mine. The cattle, the man, all of it, and I left that allotment as empty of anything it could want as I could make it, with its own wild country standing wide open to it the whole length of the line. Then I rode out. I didn't spend another night in that camp. I rode down in the last of the light and the first of the dark, down off that allotment for the last time. And I'll tell you the truth, the thing followed me part way. I heard it, working the timber off to the side of the trail as I rode down, keeping pace, the way it had kept pace with the herd. It bawled once, far off. It called my name once, Harlan's voice, fainter. And then, somewhere down low, as the trail came off the high country and the lights of the valley showed away out ahead, it quit. It just quit and fell back, and I rode the last of the way down through a quiet I hadn't known in a month, and I understood, the way I'd understood the wrong things all summer, that it had turned back. that it had reached the edge of what it would do, the edge of its own country pulling at it, and with nothing left on the allotment to hold it, and its own ground standing open behind it, it had let me go and gone home. I never grazed that high section again. Harlan asked me about the cut fence, and I told him I'd cut it, and I told him why, the whole of it. And Harlan looked at me the way you'd look at a man you'd known a long time who'd just told you something that made you wonder if you'd ever known him at all. And then he didn't say anything more about it. And I think that's because some part of Harlan, who'd grown up in that country whatever he pretended, knew enough not to push. We pulled the permit on the high end, ran cattle only on the lower allotment after that, miles back from the wilderness line, and we put up a new fence well down from the old boundary, and I never once, in the years I had left on that outfit, took a single head up against that line again. The cattle did fine on the lower ground. We never lost another one to a clean hole in the throat. And I never again heard a cow bawl in the night that turned out not to be a cow. Benny Sosi started coming around again, after, not right away. But sometime that fall, his truck showed up at Harlan's place again, and he sat on the porch and drank coffee the way he always had. And the day I saw him there, I went and sat down by him, and neither one of us said much. And after a while, he asked me, low, if I'd left it open, the line. I said I had. I said I'd opened every gate and cut the fence in 3 places and given it the whole far side. And Benny nodded, slow, and he looked off toward the mountains, and he said one thing, and then we never spoke of it again, not once, in the years we both had left. He said that I'd done right, that most people, when that thing comes, fight it or run from it, and both of those keep them tangled up with it, because fighting it and running from it are both about you and it, and what it wants is for it to be about you and it. He said the only way clear was to make it not about you at all, to take yourself and everything you cared about clean out of it, and give the thing its own country back, and leave it nothing of yours to want. He said I was one of the few he'd ever known who'd worked that out in time, and then he drank his coffee, and we talked about the price of hay, and that was the end of it. That was a long time ago now. I'm an old man, older than Benny was that summer, and Benny's gone, and Harlan's gone, and the outfit's been sold twice over, and I don't know who runs cattle on that lower allotment now, or whether they know to stay down off the line. I've never told this to many people because most people, when you tell them, get a look, and I understand the look, because I'd have had it myself before that summer. But I'll tell you what I know, for whatever it's worth to you, and then I'm done. There is a country up against the Gila wilderness boundary where something lives that I don't have a name for, except the name that's gotten into all the stories, the Skinwalker, and that name is probably wrong, and probably an insult to people who know better than I do what it really is. I don't claim to understand it. I only met it the one summer, and I only got clear of it the one way, and I've spent the rest of my life grateful that an old man named Benny Sosi cared enough to come find me at a porch on a summer morning, and tell me the one thing that thing couldn't change about itself. It belongs to its own country. It always wants to go home. And if you ever find yourself across the line from a thing like that, the only thing I know to tell you is don't fight it and don't run. Just give it back its ground. Take everything of yours away, and leave it nothing of yours to come for. That's all I've got. That's the whole of it. I haven't been up that high since, and I never will be again, and I sleep fine these days, and when I hear a cow bawl in the night now, I know it's a cow, and you've no idea, you can't have any idea, what a mercy that is.
I did text you. Is it lagging hard? I guess video. So
imagine being somewhere so remote that there is no quick way out. No streetlights, no cell service, no nearby house, no passing cars, just trees, water, mountains, and miles of empty country in every direction. Now imagine.
Still I steady hand. I